Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean Manning. And it is my pleasure to be here today with all of you. First, I thought I would actually, although that was a great introduction, I thought I would introduce myself and briefly run through what it is that I do today and give you a little bit of background about how I've gotten to where I am now. You'll find it gives you some helpful perspective in terms of how I started thinking about leadership from the middle, as opposed to the traditional way you think of leadership, which is really from the top. And then that will just kind of move us right into the topic of today's talk. So let me just talk briefly about my role at Morgan Stanley and a little bit about what I do there. So my title, as Dean Manning said, is Global Head of Risk Management for Fixed Income. What does that mean? Fixed income is a sales and trading division. I run risk management for that division from within the business, so not a control function at the bank, but rather part of the business management. And I do that worldwide. To give you a sense of geography, Morgan Stanley, like any investment bank, runs itself through 3 global regions: the Americas, Europe, Middle East and Africa, which people call EMEA, and Asia Pacific and Japan. I've got teams based in all 3 and in locations within those regions. If you're not that familiar with investment banks, all of this may sound somewhat esoteric. That's fine. My family doesn't know what I do either. And it's really, it won't be important for the talk, so don't worry about that. But I'll give you a little bit just so that, it's not completely disorienting. So sales and trading, I mentioned, that's a public side division in any investment bank. What we do is we literally buy and sell and distribute securities in the public markets. And our clients are institutions. So companies like BlackRock, people have heard of PIMCO, Fidelity. These are big asset managers that are trading in the markets every day. Fixed income securities or debt securities basically includes bonds, foreign exchange, derivatives, loans, and any other kind of derivative. So it's a complex part of the public markets. Now, within Morgan Stanley, the fixed income division globally has, roughly 1,300 or 1,400 people. And just to give you a sense of my own team running risk management for the division, my own team is about 260. So I'm running that number of people globally. And some of that is permanent and some of it is temporary resource as well. Not everyone is located in the same place, so they're spread over about 6 or 7 locations. So you can imagine that kind of creates some logistical challenges. What we cover is essentially all of the risk that a public division takes other than literally trading. So I don't have any traders who report to me, but I do have pretty much everything else. That comprises what people consider to be quote unquote non-market risk. And that is everything from what we call franchise risk, which is preserving the reputation of the institution, making sure that we're trading with the right people, the right counterparties, and doing the right kind of business. Operational risk, risk that involves literally how we operate and what we do day to day. Risk that arises from documentation, from our counterparties who we actually face in transactions. Plus, we run surveillance and supervision. We run regulatory change initiatives, change the bank initiatives, things to do with client onboarding and offboarding, and related due diligence. In short, it's a lot. And it is literally, like I said, you can see why sort of risk management is part of our business management of a division like that. My team has people from really diverse backgrounds, all different skill sets. I have people who used to work in operations, who used to be lawyers, who are ex-military, all of whom sort of work for me and bring all of those different skills to sort of one team doing this role globally. And I'm part of the core leadership team for the fixed income division globally, global operating committee for the division, and of course, other governance committees within the firm. I'm also involved in some industry associations outside the firm. You can imagine for financial services, it's important that, given that we're all kind of facing each other as market participants, one of the things that's really important is not only that we are regulated and that regulators understand what we do, but also that we set our own goals and we set our own standards. That's something that certainly post-crisis there's been a lot of focus on. And industry associations that existed pre-crisis have evolved post-crisis to sort of to provide forums for industry participants to literally get around a table and discuss areas where perhaps regulators, they don't get as into the weeds and are not in a position to be able to set standards, but we do that as an industry. One of the ones that does that in Europe is called the International Capital Market Association, or ICMA, and I chair that organization. They're an industry body that has about 550 member firms, represents all parts of the market, so banks are sell side, buy side, exchanges, trading platforms, and issuers. And we aim to promote better functioning capital markets by getting members to agree market standards, and also by trying to serve as an information provider to regulators, governments, and to various parts of the market to make sure that the information flow is also symmetrical. And so I was elected chair of that organization last year, the first woman to be given a position like that, and setting the organization's agenda and strategy and navigating our activities over the last year, especially against a really uncertain political backdrop with Britain's potential exit from the European Union going on, has been a really interesting and rewarding challenge. So if anybody has questions about that, when we do pause for questions at the end, feel free to ask. So how did I get here? I'll be very, very brief about my background, but I do think that it will give you a little bit of sense of my own perspective and why I started to think about leadership, not necessarily from the top, but from the middle. So I took a really circuitous path into financial services. I was actually a conservatory-trained musician to begin with. I studied at Juilliard in New York. And then I stopped doing that and went and decided to study English literature instead. So I did English literature and political science, also in New York at Columbia University. And then I ended up here at Harvard Law School, frankly, without a ton of direction about what exactly I was planning to do, or what kind of lawyer I would aspire to be. I actually didn't know any lawyers when I started here. There certainly weren't any in my family. I come from what I think of as a kind of, was really a second generation immigrant family, Italians from New York, and Polish from rural Massachusetts. So those are the communities I grew up in, and was taught very much about, school was really important and hard work, and that was kind of where I came from. And so when I first arrived here, I thought I'd be a courtroom litigator because all I knew about lawyers was what you saw on TV or what you saw in newspapers, and that was all about, courtroom stuff. Ultimately, when I was here, I did a ton. I was able to sample. So I had so many opportunities to sample different things. I did clinical programs, internships, obviously summer placements, and tried a lot of things. And at the end of it, my view changed. I ended up being recruited to a firm overseas in London, which was a very unique opportunity back in those days. Firms didn't hire you just to go overseas, and especially for someone like me. So I gave you a little bit my background. In my family, when we went on vacation, we drove the car. We did not get on planes. And so for me, the idea of overseas never even occurred to me until I got here and spoke to people who had looked at opportunities like that. And to be honest with you, when I interviewed with the firm that I joined, and they flew me to London for the callback interview, I thought this was amazing. Okay, it was like the most amazing thing ever. So, so for me, it was a very different type of opportunity. Ultimately, as Dean Manning said, I joined one of the Magic Circle firms in London, Allen & Overy, and I practiced as a corporate lawyer doing M&A and capital markets work. I did that as an associate for about 7 years before I joined Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley was a client of the firm. To build a relationship with the firm, or a deeper relationship, I actually went on secondment to Morgan Stanley and worked in capital markets there, which is how I built a broad network within the firm, and which is also how, when I went back to my law firm, I eventually got a phone call from Morgan Stanley saying, hey, how would you like to come here and be an equity capital markets banker for us? So that was an opportunity that I took. I actually took it in 2007, just before the crisis. Very interesting time to be at an investment bank. And I stayed in capital markets all the way through, so all the way through the crisis period, and eventually, as companies started raising capital post-crisis, I worked in that area. Eventually, I took over a structuring team that did debt and equity products, which is how I started getting into debt products from equity. And in 2013, I became the COO and the risk officer for global capital markets in Europe. And then also, after that, Asia Pacific and Japan. So I did 2 out of 3 global regions that way. And that was when I first started really thinking about leadership in a different way. And we'll get into that a little bit as I get into the subject matter. In 2016, I was asked whether I'd be interested in taking on something new within the firm. And that's how I actually ended up in fixed income. So, moved from private side to public side, completely new division. And I was asked to go there and build a team. It was after what was a very public restructuring of fixed income at Morgan Stanley in 2015. And they started to put different sort of team constructs in place. One of the ones they wanted to build was called business unit risk. They wanted to build it globally. They were looking for a head in Europe. And so I took on that challenge and started building that team a couple of years ago. And recently, I was given the role to do that same job globally. So now I run that team globally for all regions. As you can see, this is certainly not something I set out to do when I started working, or anything that I even frankly heard of, when I was growing up. I've done a lot of different roles also in my career, both at the law firm and at the bank. And so, in doing that, I thought a lot about talent and leadership, especially at levels below the boss level. I think people do a lot of, you do a lot of work and you see a lot of really visible leaders, whether they're politicians or they run companies or, they run big groups. But before that, I think, if you explore, you'll find that they were also exercising leadership well before they were given the top job. And I saw a lot of that as I moved into a management role, for the first time in global capital markets. And, you learn a lot doing that. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if, when I had been a student, I was asked to sort of think about these things. And so that's kind of what got me thinking about leadership more from the middle or from the first part of your career rather than once you get to the top. So that should hopefully bring us into today's topic, which I'm calling leading from the middle. What I intend to cover as we explore that is really 4 key questions or 4 kind of sections or ways to think about this. The first, and hopefully they will lead to each other, so this should have some logical structure. The first is really what is leading from the middle? How does that differ from leading from the top? And then I'd like to get into kind of what do opportunities to lead from the middle look like? How are they identified? How can someone in the middle find those opportunities? And then really get into the why, sort of why should you lead from the middle? Why should organizations want that? And then finally, I'll conclude with a few thoughts about how one might do that, some key points and some practical challenges. And then I thought I would open for questions. So if we start with what is leading from the middle, so I'm just going to boil it down. Put simply, and I've said this already, it's leading not from the top, or as an executive, but rather from the middle level where you have people above and below you. In other words, it's really leading from the position that you'll be in when you're in your first kind of 10 years of working. And while we're at it, I think we should define leadership too. For me, leadership fundamentally is attitude and approach. It's about ownership. Okay, so leadership is taking ownership of something plus accepting responsibility for the outcome or status of that thing. All right, so at a senior level, you're obviously taking ownership of a whole business or a whole company or a whole team. But at the middle level, you take ownership as well. You're just taking ownership of a project or an issue to be solved. And when you own something, it's quite different. If you think about this, your mindset's really different when you think, I own it. Because inevitably, the minute you own something, you start thinking, well, how can I make this better? Or how could I improve it? How could I do it differently? As opposed to just taking on something and executing. And so, for me, that theme of ownership is going to be something that I return to throughout, as I talk about this. So what's the difference between leading from the top and leading from the middle? Well, when you talk to senior leaders, like CEOs of companies, or senior partners or others who run enterprises, their job is to be in charge. So when you ask them, what's it like to be a leader? How do you think about leadership? At least in my experience, what you find is they say it's all about the ability to make decisions, okay? They're like, you're the decision maker, buck stops with you. So, you got to be able to make decisions. It's really key to make decisions. And they say that's a key skill. Some also call out the importance of setting a vision, maybe being able to communicate that vision. But I find, honestly, and I've talked to a lot of CEOs, I find that the number one thing they think about or they say is, making decisions, being in charge. And that's because as the boss, that's your job. Your job is to have authority and exercise your authority. But when you're leading from the middle, you're not in charge, at least not of the whole enterprise. Your job is to execute. You're actually there to execute the vision and strategy that's been set for you by the head of the organization or by the head of your team. But that doesn't mean you can't lead from the middle. And it also doesn't mean that any positive change made in any organization, for example, solving problems or issues within the organization or filling gaps within the organization, it doesn't mean that those things should only be done from the top. Quite the contrary. In my view, it's often from the middle of any organization that real improvements, whether they're issues to be solved or gaps to be filled or something new to be introduced, can be most accurately identified and actually dealt with. So I think we need leaders from the middle in any big organization to foster positive change and progress from within. But how does that actually happen? I think if you take from the point of view of the person in the middle, what this means is you need to find opportunities and you need to find opportunities to lead. Once you find them, then you need to figure out how to deploy a group of people, often your peers, people that you do not control, to follow you and help you deliver the result. So that brings us to sort of my second key question and key challenge, because I think, a lot of this is about key challenges. How do you identify these leadership opportunities from the middle? What do they look like and how do they appear? Well, when you're in the middle of any organization, leadership opportunities can arise formally and they can arise informally. Formal leadership opportunities are obvious. They fit firmly within the firm's structure. The most common example is a work assignment or something that, client question, something your boss asks you to do. They put you in charge of something, piece of work. You need to deliver the piece of work. You might be given a couple of people to help you. Those are junior to you and your team. Your authority comes from the boss. So the boss says, please do this, deliver this, here's the people who can work for you. And your leadership opportunity is delivering that piece of work or that project. For me, that's not where we want to focus today. What I want to focus on is informal opportunities, okay? Leadership opportunities that don't come from your boss. For example, you might find there's an issue in your workplace that you or others acknowledge needs to be fixed or remedied or addressed. I'm sure if you ask anyone who works in a big institution or organization of any kind, could be a university, or it could be a government, or it could be a big company or a small company. Anybody that you talk to who works there, I'll bet if you said, hey, can you come up with 3 things that could be better about this place? They would be able to rattle that off the top of their heads easily, right? I'm sure you guys all can just from being here, right? Or name 3 things that you could improve. I'll bet that would not be difficult. There's also probably a gap too. So if you ask instead, hey, can you think of a couple of things that we don't offer today that would be really great if we offered? Again, those same people, no problem. I'll bet you they could come up with probably a litany of these things, maybe a list of 5 or even 10. These could be, and in a business, they could even be business ideas, things like, I bet you we could, make a lot more money if we did X. These things, problems and gaps, they're all informal leadership opportunities for someone in the middle of the organization to address. Why is it really for someone in the middle? Well, someone in the middle is senior enough to understand the problem. They're probably senior enough to have built a network of people around them who can help them solve it. And they're still junior enough to have time to address it and to do so in a practical way. So they're just in the weeds enough, and they also have enough knowledge to be able to address a problem like that. And in such cases, from the middle position, you have a choice. So imagine you're around the water cooler with your friends talking about the 2 or 3 things that you really wish were different about your workplace. You can either join your colleagues and complain about your workplace, which a lot of us do, and do nothing. Or you can actually take one of those things, take some ownership, and actually think about a solution. And then you can deliver that to the group. That is deciding to lead from the middle. And I can give you a couple of examples, of things that have just arisen in my own workplace that will illustrate this. So one is, the first one is sort of staffing, okay? So in banks and law firms and a lot of big organizations, teams are structured hierarchically. Individual employees tend to belong to teams. This is a natural way of organizing, organizing people. The teams are tiered by seniority. Everyone has their role in the team. Without the junior people in the team, the senior people in the team can't deliver their projects or their work. Okay, so the junior people are a necessary part of teams' delivery and output. In capital markets, we had an issue. The issue was that there are periods where deal flow and urgent assignments from clients would pick up more quickly than anticipated for a lot of teams. It would also be lopsided. So, like in any business, you have, certain parts of the business are really busy and some parts might not be so busy. In the markets, there are certain sectors that are very popular at certain times and others that are not as popular. And since our teams tend to be organized that way by product, by sector, what would happen is some teams would get swamped, inundated with requests, and other teams would have a lot lighter flow. The problem was that meant that the junior staff on the teams that got inundated, they would get swamped pretty fast and they would be beyond capacity. And people on other teams, they had more capacity, but they weren't in the right team. So, what you ended up with was this kind of, I guess, asymmetry between workflow and teams and no good way of people to access the junior resource across the silos. So one of the people in the middle, in this case, an executive director, so the level below managing director and definitely below boss level, somebody who just worked on one of the line teams on the floor, approached management and said, and by the way, this was creating a lot of consternation among the junior people in the floor. It sort of doesn't look fair, certain people getting more work than others, and so forth. So this ED approached management and pointed out the issue and said, I actually have a suggestion. I don't know how interesting this is to you, but if we had a staffing program which was individually managed by an independent person, maybe that could be a way of making sure that the junior resource is accessed appropriately and calibrated to the workflow. Management said, yep, I acknowledge it's an issue. Go ahead and implement your solution. Let's see how it goes. And in this case, that was 8 years ago, and the system that person put in place is still there. And it was actually very simple. It involved 2 people staffing the team on a rotating basis, very straightforward. Everybody bought into it, and it solved, a problem that, was actually creating broader issues and of many kinds for the team. And by the way, that person got promoted to managing director 2 years later. So, and one of the reasons was because they showed, proactive leadership skills in sort of marshaling that solution. Another example that I kind of immediately think of that came from even a more junior level. And frankly, I don't know if you know how hierarchy works in investment banks, but when you come in entry level as analyst, so your first 3 years you're an analyst, and then you're an associate for another 3, and then you're a VP, and so forth. So a few senior analysts were meeting, at a discussion group, sort of a lunchtime session. And they said, wouldn't it be cool if we had TED-style talks at the firm? That would be really cool. And they all said, yeah, that'd be great. I bet you a lot of people would like it. And so 2 of them decided to actually, take that seriously and find out if this could even be possible within the firm. They approached, they happened to be in the same division. They approached the COO of the division, who they thought was kind of a cool person and would get it. And so they pitched their idea. And they said, we think this would really improve employee morale. We could do it at a very low cost. And it would really be a forward-looking thing for the firm to do. It happens at other companies, happens at our clients. Why not here? And the senior person really liked the idea and agreed to help them. And so together, leveraging the help of the senior person, these 2 analysts built a small team of analysts who together, within a year, brought a TED Talk style event to the firm. It was a huge success. It was watched in person and online by over 1,000 people live, and was watched in recording by many more after that. And it was repeated in subsequent years. So, and it did actually improve employee morale. So another, it's sort of another example of, people sort of taking ownership at a relatively junior level and being able to sort of marshal something that benefits the community, benefits the whole, and really made a lot of people not only notice them, but feel good about, what was going on around them and in the workplace more broadly. So there's a couple of things about how that I want to just mention before we all get really excited about suggesting a lot of really cool things to do in our workplace or school environment. It's important, obviously, to recognize that whatever opportunity one chooses needs to be in line with firm strategy, management, and management purpose, and so forth. And you need buy-in to pursue. Okay, that's one theme that you'll notice in both my examples, is that management bought in. And then once you've received that, I think that another sort of interesting aspect is you need to use your skills and your network to get all the help you need to deliver the result. And often the interesting part of that, from a middle perspective, is these are not people that you own. These are not people that directly report to you. This is essentially one of the products of building your own peer network and knowing people that can help you and are going to buy into the project that you're doing. That is a different skill set though related, but is a different skill set than the person at the top of the structure who can just say, I have the authority, this is what we're going to do. I could speak for hours on that topic. We don't have time for that particular aspect today. Instead, I do want to focus a little bit on why, because I think it's important. Why should you lead from the middle anyway? Why not just like sit at your desk and do your job? Sounds like kind of a pain. I mean, why should you make all this effort? And why should organizations want you to do it? So from the point of view of the individual, I've alluded to some benefits to successfully exercising leadership from the middle. First of all, learning to lead from the middle will teach you important skills you'll need to deploy leadership skills later on in your career as you become more senior. But, and this might be even more interesting to those of you who are in the middle, it would also show senior people, your boss's boss, and so forth, that you are someone who proactively exercised leadership for the benefit of the organization. This should set you up pretty well to be tagged as one of the organization's future leaders, which is a very good thing for anyone in a middle position. And in almost every organization, having been part of promotion processes, in multiple divisions, multiple firms, the question whether someone has already acted as a leader or shown the ability to lead is very key in terms of who gets selected for leadership opportunities going forward. So it is very important, not only in skill building, but also in showing your skills in that area. In addition, I think there are also some clear benefits for the organizations themselves. Assuming the issues or gaps to be remedied are in keeping with management strategy, having people from the middle deployed in solving those problems can create real tangible benefits within the organization. Both the examples I gave are illustrations of that. The firm benefited materially from both of those things and is still reaping the benefits. In addition, having middle position individuals thinking like owners and volunteering to spot and solve issues or address gaps can help organizations stay ahead of the curve. They can avoid small problems becoming bigger. They keep up with developments or trends happening outside. And all of that is what organizations or corporations need to keep pace, which I think is also really important. It also helps employee morale. I can't tell you how important it is. I'm sure this will be intuitive to a lot of you. For employees to see others taking on challenges at their level and being able to address an issue, is something that really makes them feel like they can also be owners too. And that's huge in terms of making the workplace a place people want to be in. And so I think that adds to morale, and then quite frankly, having the issues fixed adds to morale too. I mean, these ideas are coming from, you as an employee. Making the workplace better is always going to improve morale. And then, I sort of think, why wouldn't you just want to make things better, right? Why wouldn't you want to achieve that? So I think for me, that's the why. Finally, just before I open it up, just some practical advice. How do you actually do this? How do you lead from the middle? What are some key principles that you can maybe take away? So first of all, think like an owner. I think I've said that already. To be a leader at any level, mindset is critical. You need to think like you own the enterprise, in order to really engage in leadership. And that means, and I have to say, I find myself doing this too. It means you're always interested in how to improve things. You sort of find yourself, on the weekend, you're thinking, that would be really great if we did this way. And that is really different from just being like, I'm punching a time clock, I'm doing my day job. And it will help you, just be better at your job as well. So think like an owner. Don't just complain at the water cooler. Think, how can I make things better? The second thing is you have the ability to decide what progress is. I mean, how great is that? When you identify opportunities for change and what changes are good to make, that's coming from you. You can make that happen. You can define what change is needed. And when you learn to lead from the middle, that's what you're delivering for yourself and for your colleagues. In that context, I think it's important to recognize that small changes can yield big results. This is not about coming up with like the most genius idea in the history of the world. You don't need to do that. This is, you can actually make small changes, and it can make things it can make huge improvements for organizations. In my examples, neither of those was a super technological advancement, and yet they made massive improvements in how business functioned or in employee morale. And then obviously, once you've identified an opportunity to pursue, important that you get buy-in from around you to pursue it. Number 3, cultivate what I call constructive skepticism. So this is about challenge. Challenge what you see in front of you in any organization. Learn to ask questions and challenge assumptions. I think this is a huge thing. Never just take what's read, especially not if someone tells you, if you say, I don't understand why this is happening this way. If someone says, well, it's always how we've done it, to me, that's always, that's a ripe one for a why question. Now, the big caveat, and why we're leading from the middle and not from the bottom, is you need to learn how things work first. Then you can unpack and challenge effectively. So this is not about challenging everything or just asking why kind of willy-nilly without discretion or discrimination. This is about looking around you, though, and taking a real active interest in kind of why things are the way they are, and not being afraid to ask whether that makes sense. Finally, teamwork. Teamwork is critically important to your success. You must learn to build a peer network and how to work in a team from any level. You will fail in a big organization, probably, or in any organization, if you're unable to work well in a team. As a related point, teams are not just people that report to you or report to your boss. They're everyone around you in support functions, in other teams, in other offices, in other divisions. I cannot tell you how important it's been that I've built relationships with people in areas that I don't work in, because quite frankly, if you think about it, if you don't know something, your friend who does the same thing as you probably doesn't know either, but that person from some other office or from some other team, they might be much more likely to be able to help you. And so if you've built a relationship with that person, they're also going to be incentivized to do so. So that's really key. Another thing that is also key there is you must also learn to share and give credit. Leaders credit people who help them. They give credit to others for the projects they work on, and they're always willing to share. So that's also just a kind of another key important point. So with that, I'm happy to open it up for questions. I mean, this is, really about presenting this concept to you and getting you to understand, how I see leading from the middle. As I was saying, I think this is really key, and for me, the why is key. I think, by learning to be a middle leader, you're sort of not only learning really important skills and helping yourself build a better career, but you're making your workplace better around you. And for me, aspirationally, coming from management in organization, I want as many employees around me to be doing that as possible, because I really think that's how we make real positive change in the workplace. So, so with that, I'll open it with questions, or 4 questions. Thank you.